Well, thank you so much for that generous introduction. It's always fun to hear my life in review. It keeps getting longer. And I want to just thank everybody who's been involved in bringing me here to read. It's super exciting to be part of this series where you have a bunch of heavy hitters. I watched the John Jackson lecture, which was awesome. And you have these amazing community members, friends of mine coming up, Andre Middleton, Aaron Yankee, Sarah Merck. It's really a fantastic series. I'm honored to be a part of it. And thank you, Phil, for connecting me to this scene also. Well, and all of you guys. I mean, I know you have a lot of options for what you're going to do with Thursday night. There's a lot of entertainment out there. And you could watch this on streaming later, but I'm glad that you chose to come be here in person, because what you want to know and what you want to talk about is going to shape what we talk about, So I have a lot I could show in the first. I have like 20 minutes to sort of introduce you to who I am before we launch into a Q&A about it, or a live conversation here with Phil about it. So I know I will go over 20 minutes, so I'm kind of going to pick and choose a few things right now, but we can go back to other stuff later. There can be an encore screening. I just wanted to let you know who I am and where I'm coming from, especially when I talk to college groups like this. I like to just let y'all know, I was once in your shoes, and how did I get to the point I'm at now? It's an interesting question. Everyone has their journey. A couple of things I might mention. Let's say, well, I'll just leave this up for now. I'm from the East Coast. I'm from Poughkeepsie. Anyone ever heard of Poughkeepsie? Maybe, yeah. It's outside New York City. I'm the children of immigrants, or my grandparents were the immigrants. They were from Italy and Ireland, and then their kids went off and did other things in the United States. And so I have that kind of immigrant story where they were the first in their family, and then I'm the next generation. And I lived in New York State for 30 years. I mean, there's more I could say about that, but I went to Cornell University, and I, like you were saying, I kind of picked up a camera that my parents had around the house, like a big old VHS camera. This is like in the 90s, and just started playing with it and kind of have never stopped. I've been really interested in consumer technology, the kind of things we can do with small cameras, easy to use cameras, that kind of stuff. As you'll see, I'm not super high tech. I teach a class at Cornell, or at PSU, called Low Tech Cinema. I've upped my production values because I started to want to make documentaries, and I think that's more what this group is interested in, actually, is the kind of wider reaching social justice films I've made. So I have upped my production values a little bit for that. But you'll see they're still kind of loose and improvised and intimate, even within that. And just to let you know, I mean, I kind of started out as somebody who was always making films and videos, independently, and very independently, not raising $100,000, but literally using any camera that was around and making movies with it with my friends. I kind of needed to do that as a teenager and college student. I just was creative and needed to do it. And so I don't have examples of that now, but I made like horror films where like stuff would be exploding out of people's bodies and stuff. I think I had a kind of vexed relationship to food as a young person, which many, especially young women, do, and people continue to throughout their lives. And so, and it came out in these interesting, funny ways. I don't make stuff like that now, but I was always doing that kind of thing with whatever technology was available. And so eventually, somehow, I lived in New York City after college and made films that I showed like at night in places like the Knitting Factory, these different like music venues that would have, like, it was sort of related to like underground film, which is sort of not as much a thing these days. But, it was not like in movie theaters, not on TV. These were like small communities that came together often around music or something. And so... And they also would show films and stuff like that. So I was kind of around that like 90s, early 2000s, independent music and film scene in the U.S., I guess, just to let you know where I'm coming from. And so then I did go to graduate school. They let me into this one program at the University of Buffalo, where it was all focused on experimental and documentary and independent media, all kinds of experimentation with media. There was like virtual reality, all this this interesting stuff going on. I did not connect with those guys much because, like I said, I was super low tech, but I thought it was really fascinating that like people were really trying to innovate with media or ask what technology could do in society or do for human relationships or all that kind of stuff. And so to give you a sense of like what the personal stuff I used to do was like, you know, I was always concerned with things like public space and behavior. You know, it's kind of natural that I eventually made the bigger documentaries I eventually did. The things like this I made in graduate school. This is pretty emblematic. It's short. And that piece, I also even made an art gallery version that had 2 monitors where that was very different, where the sort of feet jump from one monitor to the other, like across the room, you know? So, and it's different stuff like that. But I have all this work I'm not going to talk about tonight because there's just so much more I've done that has to do with the art world and art galleries. But I'll mention it sometimes. But so, you know, I was always, I mean, that kind of piece came from like a whim I followed one day. You know, I just used to carry a camera all the time and said, what would happen if I just danced everywhere every day? I was going through a difficult time in my life then, which I'll mention now. And fear was a big part of my life. I was afraid of the United States government, which I'll mention in a second. And so I was trying to purposely do things that made me scared, just to see if I could push past that and, you know, question why I was fearful. And it's even something as simple as dancing in public. You know, I was like, why am I afraid of that? Why is that so strange? So I kind of said, well, I'm going to explore that. I'm going to force myself to do it, and I'll document it and maybe make something out of it, which I did. And so, and like I said, it totally came in that way. It's not like I sat and storyboarded. I don't make films in a normal way. You know, I didn't have all the things they teach you to do. They're good ideas, but that wasn't and still isn't really how I make stuff. Most things are extremely unplanned and are a lot about being present in the moment and seeing what's really there. And so the reason I mentioned this thing about being fearful, I had an experience happen while I was in graduate school in Buffalo, which I thought I'd mention to this crowd because it kind of explains why I got involved with like social justice media at all. Did anyone ever hear of this case of, in the early 2000s, there was an art professor at the University of Buffalo who's under investigation for being a bioterrorist? You might not have ever heard about this. Well, I'm here to tell you. And so it was 2004. I was in my first year graduate school, just finished up, and I'll tell you real fast. This is my one good story, and this is also one of those defining moments in your life. I mean, I'd be curious to hear if you guys ever have these kind of things where everything in my life is before and after this thing, right? You know, I kind of actually just had another big one last summer, which we don't need to talk about. It's more personal. But this one changed the course of my life, okay? And so what happened was this professor was part of a, you know, leftist collective that made art projects that were critical of the biotech industry and different, whatever they wanted to be critical of, you know, they were called Critical Art Ensemble. And so in the early 2000s, even like, you know, yeah, you maybe have heard of them. So at that time, I mean, now GMOs are being like labeled on bags and stuff, but at the time it was just a thing to even try to make more public dialogue around this. And so his wife died, one of the members of this collective, and in her sleep. And this is not long after 2001, this is only 2004. So there's a lot of paranoia. I mean, there still is, but at that time especially, there was a lot more anti-terrorism efforts in the U.S. And so, I mean, there still is. And so, but there was something called a Joint Terrorism Task Force in Buffalo and in lots of other cities, which was just extra FBI agents who were there to investigate terrorist activities and stuff. And so this professor, people saw, like when they came to get his wife's body, they saw like petri dishes and they saw like science equipment equipment, and they were suspicious, the emergency people. So they called the Joint Terrorism Task Force. I'd always loved to know about that moment, And then the rest is history. This guy became the subject of a bioterrorism investigation. He had nothing to do with bioterrorism, He was a pro-peace activist, But me and a lot of other people in our community got roped into this pretty high-profile investigation that involved a grand jury being convened. I mean, at this time, I didn't know what all this stuff was, I hadn't interacted with the so-called justice system very much in my life at that point, at age like 25. And so... but it took over my life for a while. I was interviewed by FBI agents. They flew me. I was living in Alaska for the summer, and they flew me back to testify in front of a grand jury. There's a lot more details to it, but it was a harrowing experience, and it kind of opened my eyes, though, to what is really happening. It still is happening in the U.S. What this thing called state repression is. I unloaded the libraries section on the FBI and found out that as long as there has been an FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, there have been dissidents, people or just people who don't fit into American society, or that they think, who have been, either taken away, killed, taken to prison. All kinds of stuff has happened to people. And this, at age 25, was news to me because I went to Cornell University and didn't take that class. And I went through this whole period of being angry about that. How come I didn't learn more about that, But I've figured it out, I read as much as I could about radical movements in the U.S. for the past 100 years, and so especially focused on the 60s. And so that kind of became my main point of inspiration after that, and still is a main touchstone. And so, so some things like dancing in public started to seem not that hard once I started to realize that, people have endured much, much more. Sada Shakur endured and continues to endure all kinds of stuff. There are political prisoners in the U.S. still. One of them is the subject of my recent documentary, which I'll talk about. So, but I felt like it was important to mention this crowd. I don't always mention it. People sometimes think these impulses, I think it's important to talk about where these impulses come from, like when you have a social justice impulse, like just what is that about, like, is it some need you have, some curiosity you have? Is it some personal connection you have to the topic that you're interested in? Just what is it? I do think is important because it'll determine the way you investigate it. It'll determine your level of commitment to it, that kind of stuff. So when I moved out here, I don't have enough time to talk about all this stuff. Yeah, we don't need to talk about these guys. These were early 2000s art activist collectives and stuff. We'll come back to them. When I moved out here, I moved out here after graduate school in 2007 and got involved. I wanted to be around people who understood this, I was pretty shell-shocked from this whole experience. And so I, learned about different police abolition groups in Portland, not police, but prison abolition groups, and then police accountability groups and stuff like that in Portland, and wanted to connect with other people who were interested in these systems and how they interact with our lives. And so I got involved with those kind of groups. And at first, for years, I think this is another important thing. If any of you guys are anthropology majors, I never took one anthropology course, but I am informed a bit by some of the practices of anthropologists, especially since I did learn a little bit about ethnographic film in graduate school. I did what maybe anthropologists call like field work, right? Like I spent years and years not making anything about activists or social justice stuff. And I still made like my kind of personal videos, stuff about my own daily life. But I worked with activists for many years, like doing whatever they needed, documenting events, putting them online, filming protests if those kind of things were happening, or different stuff along those lines, just being like a support person for whatever they needed. I wasn't making like something about them or something interpreted through my own lens. It was sort of just documentation activities and stuff. And I did that for many years here in Portland, like 4 years or 5 years or something. And then eventually, in 2010, there were a couple of police shootings in Portland. I don't know if people are here then, that got a lot of attention, and a lot of people were trying to get this one officer fired, Frashauer, who had killed 2 different African-American men that year. And so So eventually it got to the point where activists and I started to say, well, could we do something more intentional, not just document your activities? Could we make a tool, like a media tool, that could be used to educate more people in the community about the problem of police violence in our city? This is where things went. And so the first thing we did was make this website. We thought this would be interesting. I think I'm giving you behind the scenes stuff not everybody gets, because I feel like you might be making these kinds of things, you know. First we made a website. This is now gone. It became this video, or this film, which we can pass around. If you guys want to see it, there's a study guide inside and all this stuff. And at first we thought, and this is in 2011, I guess by now, we thought putting short videos on a website would be a good way for organizers and activists to make their own events, you know, and then they could make their own 10-minute screening, half-hour screening about different things that were related to police violence in Portland. So, and we divided it up, you know, you could click on here and learn about different resistance activities you could get involved with and the history of resistance to police violence in Portland. You could click on here and hear about different community members' stories, like people who've been roughed up by police at protests, or memorial stories were these more intense stories of people who had lost loved ones to police violence. And so this was what we thought. And that was fine. We kind of launched it, you know, but there was a way that an old-fashioned film still does kind of attract a lot of people in a way that a website is not the same, you know, it's not, I don't know. For us, I found like within, this had a good response, but we eventually got, the collaborators I'd gathered with me, we decided to make it into an actual like almost 90-minute film, you know, and see what that did. And we added a lot more historical information so that it really kind of traces police community relations in Portland from, I guess it's the earliest thing is like the 70s through 2013 is when we stopped filming pretty much. So maybe 14. So we made it more like, it's still not a story. It doesn't go chronologically. It's still episodic, you know. I kind of wanted to resist telling the story, you know. I mean, no one could tell the story. And so it still sort of moves around in time and kind of follows this sort of model. And I thought, I guess, it became this. And these are my collaborators and stuff. And we changed the name of it and so on and so forth. And this became just a really, I mean, an amazing community experience for me, you know, both getting to know, I mean, I was kind of part of the community that I was representing in this, like this kind of different coalitions of activists working on this in different ways. But it was also really fascinating to share this with Portland. And I mean, it just really took off at the time when we showed it. It showed all over the Northwest. It showed around the country, and I was talking about it a couple times a week at screenings, a lot, which I hadn't expected. I had thought I had thought this was a tool for organizers, you know, and it sort of, I became one of the organizers, you know, I became someone who was talking about this topic all the time, which I hadn't expected. I thought I was kind of letting it loose, but I could show, I mean, I have tons of like inspirational material I could talk about, but I don't think there's time. I feel like you should see some clips. This is the other film I finished just this fall. I'll pass these out. I made this also around the same time. I was making these 2 feature films over like 5 years. One of them finished in like 3 years. The other one finished in 5. This one is about a woman named Bo Brown who now lives in Oakland, California, but she's from Klamath Falls, Oregon, and she got involved, she moved to Seattle eventually and got involved with a underground, do people know the Weather Underground? That's kind of a famous group of armed militant activists. There were many, many other such groups in the U.S. in the 70s especially. One of them was called the George Jackson Brigade, named after Black Panther George Jackson, who was killed in San Quentin prison. And there's this small group of, comrades who worked together and carried out a lot of bombings and of public buildings, all as protest actions. They also robbed a lot of banks. So Bo Brown robbed a lot of banks, and she was known as the gentleman bank robber because she is a very butch lesbian, and so was mistaken for being a man all the time in both police information and in news reporting. So it's showing. I just finished it in the fall. After 5 years of working on this, and it's showing again at Hollywood Theater if you guys want to come, if you can't come, you can just email me, and I can send you a link to it that's password protected. I will do that. But it'd be fun to see you at the theater. It showed in the fall at the Northwest Film Center, and it was actually really great. I think we might need some stories of badass people who have stood up to capitalism and patriarchy and white supremacy and the government in really spectacular ways right now, you know? I mean, these guys pulled a lot of stuff off, got a lot of attention for the messages they were trying to put out. I mean, what they would always do is stage some sort of bombing, make sure nobody was ever going to get hurt, and the point was to release a communique, you know, something that would be read through the new, you know, on the news that night. That was usually it was in solidarity with everything, like striking electric workers in Seattle. Like it would be like saying we just blew up this transformer in order to bring attention to the. I mean, it did bring attention to those things. I'm not advocating anybody go do anything right now, but I'm saying like it might be inspiring to watch a movie about some people who did, and get some ideas for how we can, you know, make some changes happen. So they all went to prison eventually, some for longer periods than others, but there's a lot more in the film you can learn about. So she was someone that I met during this whole time I'm describing of getting newly involved with activists in the Northwest doing police and prison activity stuff. She was someone who just was really compelling to me as a person. I thought she'd make a good portrait of a documentary, you know, subject for a portrait. She, you know, I met her at a bar after an event, some kind of prison abolition event, and she was talking about Bisquick and the many uses of it and stuff like that. And I was like, this is amazing that the old revolutionary is here, like talking about like mundane, joyful things about life, you know, how amazing Bisquick is and stuff. And so, so there's lots more of that kind of thing, not the Bisquick story, but stuff like that in the film, you know. She's amazing. So, and I know you need this whole Q&A thing. I could show you clips. I do so much research when I'm doing stuff. I watch so many other films. I mean, just stuff like this. So many other films to see how they did it, or look to other media, like drawing, like especially making a portrait of one person. I looked at a lot of like, you know, portraiture, like painting and drawing and stuff like that. And so I don't really have time to talk about it, but I'm a big film geek and watch lots of stuff and still do all the time. I guess maybe the only other thing I'll just mention, I don't even know if it's up to you guys if we have time to actually see clips. It's sort of, I think, funny to talk about this in the abstract. I mean, the only other thing I want to say is, you know, there are these two documentaries I made that are still super small budget if you really want to get into that nitty gritty. I mean, all this stuff has been made, I mean, we did a Kickstarter for Arresting Power and actually did raise money to pay for like some professionalization stuff, you know, making the audio sound good, making the color look all even. But still, you can make even a big feature film that shows in theaters, you know, for not a whole $10,000, you know, you can raise that through, I mean, still a lot of money, but not everything is made with hundreds of thousands of dollars, you know. And so this little guy is certainly under $10,000, the movie I just made that's going around. So if I had more, I think I could do awesome things. But but I also, as you see, like I kind of need to just go make stuff and can't be bogged down by having to do all the other stuff. But and this is just going back to more personal work. I mean, all throughout all this time, I've done I'm always making my own work too, you know, stuff that circulates not through big theater, well, sometimes through big theaters, but mostly through experimental film festivals, art galleries, things like that. I guess the thing maybe I'll mention, I think Phil's pretty interested in this too. I mean, I usually have some kind of daily practice. I have since graduate school. For the past like 7 years now, I've been making a video every single day with a little flip camera. It's totally outdated and old now, but I just love it. It like it's here. At least one a day. And kind of following off that like dancing in public kind of thing. It's just something, it's not something I put immediately online. It's like a notebook. It's like a way for me to, for me, it has become a way to be present in any space I'm in. Like I'm excited when I have to wait for the bus or something, because that means I get to like make a little video, you know? It's like, what can I do with like me and a camera and wherever I am? it's the funnest question to me, And so, and this has, I make my own, I make like an archive of my life this way, I then catalog all this stuff by day and month. And then sometimes I make other pieces that are more intentional, edited out of those, like these diary type pieces. I have many different kinds of diary projects. One of them is this one, White Lady Diaries. I made a piece called Impressions of Portland that is kind of talking a little bit about stuff that I didn't get to talk, the arresting power is about other people's lives. It's about other histories. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of transformation I underwent during that process in 3 minutes, what was eye-opening to me. But I didn't want that to be in the film like a Michael Moore, like, look what I'm learning thing, So, things like that. I mean, this gives me a whole space. This is the personal part of the practice, It gives me a way to process my whole life, including making other artworks or other documentaries. And so I'm kind of always examining or kind of trying to build self-awareness, and so this has become like a critically important part of my life, making something every day. And I sometimes edit them into I even started doing a monthly one, like just it was so much fun to have this daily shooting practice. I was like, I want to have a editing practice too. It's just, I also just think of these as just practices. That way, when I am editing like the real thing, like I'm already in practice. I have like some ideas, and this is totally true. Even for Arresting Power, because I've been examining the city so closely, I could go back and I knew some shots I wanted to get around town to like demonstrate what the city looked like because I'd been looking at it through this lens for so long. I kind of recreated shots and stuff like that. And so I guess I should show you some little things, like 5 more minutes. Just, I know we have this whole other thing going on. Maybe let's show you a little bit of the Gentleman Bank Robber, just because it's on my mind because I just finished it, I think. But the beginning of it, just here's how it opens. This is Bo.
Basically what you're going to do is go in this bank, take their money, get in your car, get on that freeway, and go someplace really, really quick and switch cars. You go in, you give them a note, you have to show them I never took my gun out. Always had a pistol here and a coat on. So all I had to do was open the coat, they would see the pistol, give them a note, I don't talk. And once we became known that it was the GJB, then all we had to say is this is a GJB holdup. And they were under instructions to cooperate with us. Because they didn't know how crazy we were, or if we were crazy. Of course we were crazy. The rest of you sane people don't do this, right?
Women from Seattle had said that there was the George Jackson Brigade, who we all knew George Jackson was, and that Bo had been a bank robber.
Like when this screen in the fall, people were clapping. Yeah, I was so surprised, but they were like, "Yeah, rips capitalism." I was like, "Cool."
But that they couldn't ever find her because she was actually a woman, a dyke, a butch, but they thought that she was a man, and we thought that was just sensational because we could all relate to it. We're all dykes. People think we're men all the time.
Okay. There's much, much more. But that gives you some sense also of kind of the treatment of archival materials, doing historical things, it becomes a giant research project, which, you learn about research at Reed, So that's what took so long on this. I did these interviews over the course of like 2 summers, but then spent years trying to bring that period alive by looking in archives in Seattle and Portland and everywhere. And so I wanted to kind of share that treatment too, because there's this other aspect of this background that you see here. This is actually like 16 millimeter film. I'm going to talk more about that technical stuff in the workshop tomorrow if you want to come to that. But there's some footwork happening that maybe just whirls by, but I'll explain it more tomorrow. Arresting power, maybe to give you a little bit of sense of that. It's really intense, but here's a little bit of sense of what I mean. This is hard to watch. This is about a police killing of Keaton Otis. There's still a memorial that happens for him on the 12th of every month at the site of his shooting. And so what we were doing when we tried to make these memorial stories, we have a family member talking about it, we have a community organizer talking about it. We also went to the spaces where these things happen and tried to talk about these like everyday spaces that lots of people are walking through all the time, but actually this tragedy has occurred here. There's no plaque there telling you this, but a member of our community has been taken from us in a really unjust way. And so in some ways we were trying to get into that, And so, people have told us like, oh, your film about police violence has like no police violence. I'm like, oh yeah, we didn't even think of that. It's a much more meditative project, like there's no cops in protests or anything like that, So this is the hardest one to watch for me because you do see like bullet holes.
There was a elderly African-American woman, shortly after he stopped his car, he saw her in an automobile close by and he says to her, "Please don't leave me. They're going to kill me. Please don't leave me." Within 32 seconds, Keaton Otis was tased, and he was tased by 3 different officers simultaneously. At the same time that they would like us to believe, Keaton was reaching in the glove compartment, pulling out a Crown Royal bag.
The district attorney was talking to me, and he said to me, "Your son shot an officer, and he shot from a Crown Royal bag." And so I said to him, "Well, have you done gun residue checks? Did you check his fingerprints to match it to the gun?" But one of his remarks were that really irritated me so bad, to insult my intelligence in such a manner, to say, "Well, they only do that in the movies."
No one knows what happened to the gun. The bullet that was taken out of the officer.
Maybe we should, you get a sense of some of the visual language being deployed here and stuff. There's more to see, and you can certainly watch the whole film. I think I wanted to just also mention, in between these intense stories, it's intense. The father breaks down at one point, he's crying because of his son being lost. We put these, we call them interstitials, like 30 seconds where there's no voiceover, there's no interview, there's no narrative. It's just sort of these visuals that pass by over 30 seconds that let you kind of take in what you just heard. There is some more information. These are other sites of police shootings that we mostly didn't have time to go into because it's trying to make the point that this is routine, this is something, there's so many of them. This kind of thing would happen throughout the film, where you just get sort of a moment to sit back and take in everything you've heard. Well, you are getting a little bit more like, wow, there's other people that we don't even know their stories here, And maybe the only other thing I'll just mention is more of this kind of daily practice thing, and then we can talk with Phil here. Just to give you a sense of what I mean by this, like what kind of stuff am I shooting? Lately, it's just very observational. Sometimes they're kind of performative, like this. Like sometimes, like I said, this thing of like, what can I do with me in a space and a camera, Sometimes they're like this. And they're always a minute, like about the 60 seconds. I let it go longer sometimes. And so one day, many years ago, I did this. And then it goes on. Just keeps breathing. And so, sometimes that's as simple as they are, but, I'm interested in how this changes this frame. There's this slight movement. I like seeing line. They become, in a way, these very, like, formal things they have over the years. I've gotten really into composing the frame, even if it means using my own body in some ways, or just other stuff. I mean, I love going to diners. If you follow me on Instagram, I go all the time. It's like an East Coast thing. I think I miss them, This one is all about the mustache. And so, not much happens. Goes on like that for a minute. And then this editing practice, I said, I'm going to start editing these every month and make something cool and give. And these don't go very far. Like some of the other stuff I make goes to art galleries and festivals and stuff. This is mainly my little notebook, I've been thinking of changing the whole website to be like Julie's notebook or something, just to make it clear. I just think of these as practice. Like things like, I'll then like look back at the month and edit something out of it. Like, I don't know. I don't even remember what this is. Pears have something to teach us. Why did I call it that? The pears. Oh, they were chilling. They were being still, and I thought that's what they should. It's like that's what I had to learn from those pears. I mean, I've gotten like into this zone now because I look at everyday life so closely now. I see like meaning all the time. So this is one where I like put most of I got that month in, Art factory. Others I play around with. So, I don't know. I have different. Sometimes I'm making patterns more intentionally. You can watch all these. I don't remember what I did. Robo Taco. It's just really mostly alone. I assign students all kinds of projects like this. Like I teach art students and video art stuff, and so we're always doing daily life stuff. And it's fascinating to see what different stuff people come back with. Like a lot of people have all these like social lives where they like are hanging out with friends. Mine are all totally alone at diners and stuff. So, I'm super social. I actually just don't get inspired to document it. I get self-conscious. But when these are very private moments for me when I can be really aware and think about what I want to shoot. But other people like totally bring back their fun lives. And so. Mine are all about coffee shops. So, hey, that's some of what's going on. That's the broadest strokes, of where I've come from and what I'm doing. It was an experiment, but I wanted to make sure there was room to hear what Phil had prepared, all these great questions, and also to hear from you guys. So now we'll enter the conversation part, I guess.
Great.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I went a little over, but yeah.
No, it's fine. The films are great, and we're just going to do it. We're going to talk for a little bit, do a little Q&A, and then I really would like to have some questions from you guys. Think about those right now. And Julie, there's so many places, so many directions to approach your work from. I first was introduced to your work with Arresting Power, and then quickly jumped into this labyrinth of all the rest of your work. I'd like to maybe organize around three themes, and what I'm thinking about is tensions between journalism and the first person, which certainly with Arresting Power, as well as with your minute movies, there seems to be tension there, as well as the conventional and the artistic, And I think that that's a real tension in terms of wanting to make sure that an audience can access your work. And then finally, and I think this fits in as well, is the tension that you have between the creator and the audience. Meaning that how much of this is about you and how much of this is about actually having an impact, or having an impact and making sure that there's an audience there. One place to maybe start is your current film, The Gentleman Bank Robber. And maybe I have this wrong. We met for the first time a few months ago and had a dinner together, and you talked about you had actually thought about doing the whole film just having her hair cut
Yeah.
and telling her story.
Yeah.
Why did you want to do it that way, and why did you not do that?
Oh, Phil. This is really fun, by the way. I don't usually do this, like TV show thing. Well, what Phil is referring to, how can I say this? So the first summer I went down and interviewed Beau Brown. I lived in her house with her in Oakland, California, with her and her girlfriend, and interviewed her a lot about, like, got oral history style, like, just tell us the whole thing. And she told us her whole life story over like 20 hours of video. And I tried to edit that next year, but it was great, but there wasn't any, like, the dynamic person that I fell in love with and wanted to make a video about, a documentary about, was not coming through in these, like, sitting still interview. I needed other stuff. And I'd shot a little bit, but just not nearly enough. So the next summer I went back down and shot other kinds of activities, but was also kind of interested in, as you saw, like, I shot one of her, I took her to a bank that she had robbed. That's what the beginning is, that's why she's, like, telling us how to rob a bank and stuff. But I also wanted to see if putting her in environments that maybe were a little uncomfortable or unusual, what that would do. So I took her to get a haircut because she needed it, and also and also I took her to the, what is it, like Golden Gate Park down there? I don't know the Bay Area so well, but there you can go on these paddle boats and stuff. So I was like, what if we interview her on a paddle boat? What'll that do? And great stuff came out. It does. If you guys are thinking about making media, here's just interesting tips, like going on a walk with somebody, folding laundry with them. Things that occupy their mind can make different stuff come out, or occupy one part of their mind, So actually I didn't interview her while she got a haircut. She was completely quiet for that. But that's what was so beautiful to me. I mean, it was like a 40-minute shot, and most of the time she's talking. I mean, this film is all about her talking. She talks a lot, But this was like this other side of her that was letting someone care for her, I mean, she's a lot about being, like, tough and not needing anybody and that kind of thing. But here she is, like, letting somebody cut her hair. And so it's this beautiful shot, and I put, like, it ends the whole film. I mean, it's not really introduced or explained. It's just like, this is just the last thing you're going to see. You've heard her amazing life story. Now you see her quiet for 5 minutes getting her haircut. But there was a point where, and I still might do it, where I have a whole film that is just that shot, and maybe through some soundscape or something, you learn some of these important details, they're not details, but central themes of her life or something else, but it would be a very different viewing experience. I made many efforts to make a kind of somewhat more conventional documentary where, people get interviewed and stories get told and it makes sense, It would be kind of, I still might do it. I kind of want to call it Beau Gets a Haircut.
And I mean, when you're going through this artistic conversation with yourself, how much are you thinking about the audience and whether you're going to lose them or keep them?
Yeah, a lot. And there's a third important group to be thinking about, which is the subject themselves, and, like, the activist community that this is partly for, The people who've embraced this film more than anyone else all over the country are, like, people who are involved in political prisoner support or any kind of prisoner support work. They're showing it all over the country. That they're seeing their own history represented, Beau and her comrades think of themselves as political prisoners. I mean, they are. They were people who were given much longer sentences than, considering what they'd done. And so, I think about that a ton. So I think we're in a versatile media landscape. You can just make lots of versions, in a way that short piece I didn't show, Impressions of Portland, is kind of like that. Like, we have the whole 84-minute documentary that can be used for organizing and conversations, but I have this 3-minute piece that's made from some of the same material. I just shifted it into this personal piece that shows in art galleries and experimental film festivals and stuff. So I think you can just make it all, but it is certainly on my mind. It's the main, that is the main question, is to what extent you can, how accessible you want something to be, and then these other, like how much you want to stretch yourself and other people and it brings up other questions. If you really watch 40 minutes of a haircut, you'd be thinking about some other questions. Why am I watching this? Why have I never seen a haircut? What am I I'm going to pay attention next time. Who knows? Other stuff.
And one of the things that you just remarked about Arresting Power was that in the film there's really no police violence shown.
There's a tiny bit, yeah.
And I mean, and the same thing with a story about bank robbing. I mean, we have seen so many of these movies where people bust into the bank, shotguns are fired, and we've seen a lot about police violence with newsreels, rioting, tear gas. It is interesting to me that there's a certain tension that what you're doing is much more meditative, or it's talking heads. There's a part of your film that's I found very troubling, and it's from the 70s, and about the police left some dead possums on African Americans' doorsteps. And it was just the telling of the story without that visual. And I think that's really interesting that you're using a visual medium but not using some of the conventional visuals, or at least the more gratuitous ones.
Right.
Again, can you talk about some of the tension that you have with that, or the decision making that goes into that, and especially when you were working in Arresting Power with 2 other filmmakers?
Well, sometimes I guess that's budget. I mean, maybe if we had a ton of money, we'd do some cheesy reenactments or something, but sometimes those are just, I don't think so, though. I don't know. I guess I need to develop my answer to this better. There is some reason I resist some of those conventional methods of representation. They can be effective. I mean, the Weather Underground, if that film used some reenactments that were okay. You see some hands making a bomb in that point, But I think, like you say, some of it's just gratuitous. I don't think we need it. I'm really focused on the emotional aspect of whatever these people are talking about, I mean, for Arresting Power, the focus was on what people were telling us, like their grief, their sorrow, their rage, their joys sometimes, and so we were really focused on how we would communicate that, and also bring people into a space where they're feeling that too, one person called that a feminist impulse, to be kind of, I didn't say that, but she said that, and I guess it makes some sense if you think about, it is sort of oppositional to this dominant form of just showing you everything, showing you the police barreling in and doing stuff, and so this is offering a whole other way to think about how we might grapple with this reality, what its effect is on people, that kind of stuff, and so.
Could it also be considered having some faith in your audience, that there is an audience that's out there that is willing to let the story unfold, that is willing to trust that you will present a character in their full form? I think there's a lot of pressure on filmmakers right now, both commercial and journalistic, to make things faster, make things shorter, make things more grabby.
I know.
Do you feel that pressure, and what gives you the faith to not go in that direction?
These are good questions. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm pretty independent here. Like, I'm not attached to a TV station that's pressure. I actually don't feel these pressures. When you're this independent, like you're raising the funds all on your own and stuff. It's. It might mean that your audience, though, is going to be necessarily limited, like this is going to get as far as we can get it out there, by using our own resources. I mean, luckily, Collective Eye is this distributor in town who decided to help us put it out there further, but that's the flip side to it. I mean, I'm kind of just now getting interested. Now they've made like 2 long pieces. I'm like, maybe I could do something with like actual backing and, but it's going to bring that right up, like how much whoever is paying for the production is going to want to influence what you make, so yeah.
Any idea what that
and
topic?
I'm not, and I watch like 5-hour-long film. Like I'm also kind of like mimicking what I love, you know. Like I watch so many films that are long and meditative and unorthodox and all of that, and I just love it. So I think there should be more of that kind of thing in the world.
Can you throw out 2 or 3 recent films that you've seen, documentaries in the last year or two that you would recommend?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm obsessed with one director, Frederick Wiseman. I don't know if people know this guy. He has been making films about institutions for like 45 years. He has a film called Hospital. He has a film called High School. He's an American director. And he spends, months being in like a high school or being in a meat packing factory and observing. It's just him and a camera person. That is it. 2 people. He does the sound and directing, and the camera person does the camera work, and then he makes a film over the next 6 months editing, and so this is like my dream life, really. I'm basically doing that with my daily practice. I like shoot in a kind of intuitive way and then eventually edit it into pieces, and so he just made a film called Ex Libris that was good. It's about the New York Public Library, but it's like 4 hours long, I mean, you kind of have to just settle into the zone of watching that kind of thing. So I thought that was amazing because it showed you so much of what goes on in public libraries in New York City. I mean, that's what it's about. It's New York. Like so much conversation, so many amazing speakers and authors go through there, and you just really get to see what a intellectual hub for a wide, I mean, you probably might think of this, you're in an intellectual hub here at REIT, but it's interesting to think of what other spaces in society serve that function, especially for, wider groups than people on a college campus. And so it's a wonderful film, Ex Libris. That was one good documentary. What's another good recent one? Well, I, Tanya is not a documentary, but it is a true story. And I thought there were some really interesting things about that film, if you haven't seen it. It's kind of, they use actors to re-perform actual interviews that happened, So there's some interesting truth questions that are brought up by this. It's not a documentary, though, but the film about Tonya Harding, I, Tanya.
Okay.
I thought that was an interesting thing to think about in the context of reality-based media,
Another thing that you talked about briefly, you said that in the 90s, you talked about some of your films at the Knitting Factory in New York, and that idea of underground films, and you briefly mentioned that doesn't necessarily exist as much anymore. Part of that maybe not existing is that there's not that sense of discovery anymore, but you're talking about filmmakers that I maybe haven't heard of before. Where do you recommend people go to find out about?
Well, I think I shouldn't have said that. There are creative communities here and everywhere that people need to get together and make and show stuff, and they'll do it no matter what, and they're doing it. And whether or not they call themselves underground, I mean, especially because I interact with students so much at PSU, which is great, I kind of get some connection to some of those scenes and stuff, and they're doing stuff, they're projecting stuff, it's the same thing, so it's just maybe not as self-consciously called underground, but I mean, there are certainly books that are chronicling like the New York underground in the 60s and stuff like that you could find out, that you could look up a few people, like George Kuchar and Mike Kuchar, these 2 filmmakers who were a big part of that and connected with Andy Warhol and all that stuff. I don't know.
Maybe what I was thinking about more broadly is the idea that certainly since you first started making filmmaking to now, it's easier for somebody to find a broader platform, YouTube, Vimeo, Facebook, certainly to get their films or their media projects out there. Virtues and vices.
Well, I think I found, that's what I was talking about having this one web project that we called Safe and Sound, and then changing it to this actual film called Arresting Power, I mean, the internet is great. I use it all the time. But there is still something special and important about bringing a group together for a communal experience. And I know we're doing it less in theaters, but it's not really gone, So I don't know. What was your question?
I think it was you gave an interesting response to. I think the question was more about the idea of is access to the mediums for sharing, is that all good, or are there some vices to that in terms of does that dilute maybe the quality of it, that you don't necessarily have the quality of these projects that get to be crowdsourced, that everybody has access to the medium now?
I don't know. I just think it's all good. I think it's cool that you can go online and see a video. I think it's cool that people still see movies in theaters. I guess I'll have to get back to you.
Okay.
I mean, the internet's done some, I mean, it can spread stuff really far, you know. Yeah.
I'm going to change gears a little bit, and then I want to ask some questions from the audience. Arresting Power is such a powerful film. It pulls together a long history of police violence in Portland, which is very troubling. And there's something incredibly important about that, but there's also an opportunity there to maybe walk away and feel like things aren't changing. Mm-hmm. I mean, certainly 1992 was the Rodney King video that came out. It's 25 years ago. And it's hard to say that, you know, I think at that moment when that video came out, there was an optimism that something horrible had happened, but there was a wider recognition of it. Are you optimistic or pessimistic that a movie like Arresting Power can have an impact on policies, on social change?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think culture is a part of it. I don't think it's as one-to-one as because the film was made, now all kinds of policies change and the police are fine. You know, I think it just plays a role in. I mean, some people would say, that faculty member I said, that professor I said who was under investigation for being a bioterrorist, I used to ask him this when I was in graduate school, and he would, about just art in general and its effect, and he would say, we just need to fight on all fronts, you know. He would be like, we need to have protests in the streets, we need to have policy stuff happening, we have to have legal cases, we need to have culture, not, you know, it needs to also represent what is really happening in society, you know. And so that would be like one way to answer it. But maybe I also thought that when he said that maybe it was like getting out of this question a little bit, you know, like I don't really have to put much on the line. I'll just hang out in culture here, you know. And so I mean, the first thing I thought of when you went down this road was like, look, like wherever people are being brutalized, they are fighting back. Like that is happening, you know. It is a different thing to like walk into a theater when you're living in a safe community and don't ever feel the impacts of police violence, and to walk out and then have these kind of questions on your mind. How's this going to change? You know, I mean, that's fine. But whenever there are communities fighting back every single day right now, you know, there are people who have phone chains, different ways that they're resisting police violence that are not in these official ways of trying to change laws and stuff like that, but it's happening all the time. And so, and I have faith in that, you know, and faith in like the, you know, human spirit to persist and fight back. And so, and I think it's a matter of figuring out, you know, how to involve more people in that fight. And I do think that cultural products can involve more people. I mean, over the course of that film screening, that was a fascinating time because that's when Ferguson happened and consciousness in the U.S. around police brutality. I watched it shift in those few years of making that film. Like it went from showing early edits of the film to people, certain audiences, you know, mostly like white audiences who aren't affected by this, would be like, I had no idea, you know. I'd be like, well, good thing, watch the movie, you know. And so whereas within a few years, that was a much less common response, you know, whereas more and more people were just kind of like right on. It had less of an educational function, and that's where we're at now. But really when I started it with a bunch of activists and stuff, it was partly to try to change consciousness, you know. And I'm not saying it's done, that work is done, but it is different here in 2018 than it was in 2010, you know. So that has happened, you know.
I mean, it's a great film. I mean, it's absolutely, it should be, I feel like, required watching. And for anyone that moves to Portland or has lived here, I mean, it is a troubling history, and you guys do an amazing job on opening up a number of those chapters. Are there questions?
Hi. I was wondering, you spoke to this a little earlier about remembering that the subjects, the people you're interviewing, are potentially part of your
Right,
audience.
yeah. Glad you brought that back.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had any guidelines or things you keep
Yeah.
in your head when you're editing interviews to avoid your subjects feeling misrepresented.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I kind of dropped it, but it was a huge thing. I was especially making a portrait of one person's life. I felt I don't want to do that again. It's very hard. Because I've made so much representation of myself, like all these autobiographical projects. I take it really seriously when I'm representing somebody else, to the point where I almost hardly do it. I've done it in these 2 projects, but. So especially trying to show someone's whole life. There's different strategies out there. If you get deeper into documentary stuff, some people do share the editing process with their subjects, and that can be a really interesting process, where you make sure that you're not doing anything that, say, offends them or misrepresents them. But then you are always negotiating with that person, and they have influence over this. I mean, here's what I learned from taking drawing. Let me tell you this. I took drawing classes last year because I teach in an art school, but I never went to art school. I did film stuff. And so I was always jealous of all these drawers and painters and stuff. So I took a drawing class. And what I learned is that, and this is, maybe you know this, but an artwork is always it's partly the subject, a person you're making a portrait of, but it's also just as much whoever the artist is, it's what that person is seeing in the subject coming through. If it's a vase of flowers, if it's a person, it's as much about what that thing is as it is about the artist themselves, who it's filtered through. So that's kind of true even in a documentary portrait, it's filtered through me. And so I decided because of logistics too, to keep most of the control of it. But it made me extremely anxious, especially showing it to these amazing old revolutionaries, who have given their lives for the struggles they believed in, to kind of reveal it in the fall without having run it by them. But I also was doing that because I'm the one who's also thinking about other audiences, like people who don't know anything, who have never heard of the George Jackson Brigade, the Black Panther, who have never heard of that stuff. I'm also thinking about that audience. And so I'm trying to sort of be the person in between the depth that the subject has and the lack of depth some audience member might have, and somehow make something that makes sense to this crowd, But that was always on my mind, was are they gonna hate this? Because it doesn't go into much depth about armed struggle, the ethics and politics of that. I know that that's on their minds a lot. There's reasons they blew things up that were not because they were crazy. It was because it made a lot of sense for what they were doing at the time and the context they were working in and so on. It was a tactic. It was being used all over the world. And so anyway, but I didn't go into that in the film because I just didn't have time, and also just getting the main ideas across to a wider audience was what I was interested in. So, yeah, it's a lot. It's a big responsibility making something about somebody else, So I would just be careful with it, I do think it's fascinating, though, because you're making something really about someone else, It's extremely intimate to me, They're giving you, a lot of themselves, and it's you as the maker have this, what are you going to do with that, So that's why it took 5 years to finally make this thing, so.
Other questions? I would like to, you were just giving out some advice. I think it's really interesting, Arresting Power was a collaborative.
Right.
It was 2 other filmmakers. Creative process is difficult working, let me not say that, let me not put my own judgment on it. It can be very difficult working with other people. Talk about advice for working with a team, and then some of the projects that you have. Your minute films are very personal and very solitary. So you obviously have a spectrum on this.
Yeah.
Can you filter that into advice to emerging filmmakers or artists?
Yeah. Well, no, working with people is great. it's great. And of course, like if you're doing like regular movie making where you have like a crew and stuff, you're going to be working with people. I just worked with a very small group of people. When I worked with those two other artist activists, Aaron and Jody, I kind of brought them in because I had started it myself with two other police accountability activists who, you know, was going on for many years making this project, and things kind of, I don't know how to say this. Like I stopped working with those guys and brought in these other two. I just needed help, you know. I just felt like this was such a big community issue. I didn't know all the people that would be good to know and interview and so on, you know. And these two guys had been in the community. One of them works at KBOO, one had worked at Portland Community Media and other community media spaces, and had been here for 20 years. At that point, I'd only been around for like 5 or something. So they had many decades experience in sort of activist communities here. So it was partly just like it was a good move to bring in other people who had more connections, but then it was amazing. I mean, it was like being in a band, like, and jamming all the time. Like it was having two other people who you share like politics and aesthetics with, you know, and where you can just go right away. And, like every interview was carefully considered. Like who should we interview? What exactly should we ask? Who you ask this one? You ask this one. Every single part we got to talk about how that, because we're asking people to tell us the worst thing that's ever happened to them sometime, you know, and if I had to do that alone, you know, that would just be a lot to carry and be responsible for. So having those two with me all the time was enormously helpful, and then editing everything together too. You know, we edited every single thing went through the three of us before it reached an audience. You know, so it was like a really important experience. It became much different from what I would have done alone, but it also became much bigger and, you know, a different thing. Yeah.
Did you ever have creative moments where there was two out of the three people who wanted one, and there was somebody left out of that decision and wanted to go differently? Was there ever negotiating that had to go on?
I'm sure there was. I mean, I now look back with these, it's all like, those were the good old days, you know? There's nothing that comes to mind as some big like conflict we had at all. We were mostly really on the same page about things pretty often. I can't really think of anything where it came to that.
I think I was curious to think about if that was the case, or if you could give any advice of how to move past those moments as an artist.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe even preemptively, like how to find good collaborators, you know. I mean, they're also my closest friends, you know, or became that through the process. Like people who you trust, people that you can have fun with, people who see you as a whole person too, you know. And also, like I say, this important thing that I don't have a ton of friends in this way who like we really share politics, we really share like aesthetics, you know, like one of them's in a punk band, the other, you know, and Jody and I go see these 4-hour movies together all the time, you know, and so I feel extremely blessed to have a couple of people who also are, you know, extremely committed to, you know, creating a world that is like safe and free for everyone, and that's another big part of it. And they've worked that into their lives in every way. So to me, it was finding good people in the first place. This is recorded. I love you guys. Maybe they're gonna watch this. There's other people in my community this way too, but those are important bonds, you know. But that we also just have a really good time together. Because it was listening to these stories and doing these interviews was a lot of emotional work, and so having them to kind of process it with me was really helpful, or really necessary. It would have been someone else if it wasn't them. But for the gentleman bank robber, I was doing that alone, but brought in lots of support, you know. Like I actually did the interviews over those 2 summers with 2 other friend activist people. They just don't make things too. Like they're like, I draw the line there. I'm a nurse practitioner. I'm not learning to be a filmmaker, you know, stuff like that. And so I kind of had to make the thing really, do all the tech stuff. But I definitely have, there's a long list of collaborators on that too, who just provided other kinds of support. There were like 3 assistant editors, you know. I had trouble editing this thing and brought in tons of different people at different times, and so yeah, there's more to say on all that. We could talk about that workshop tomorrow, I guess, you know.
Well, Julie, thank you for all the great work that you've done. The minute films are incredibly addictive. They're really
For
fun.
some people are like, what is this?
Can you give a little teaser about your workshop tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, some of the ideas I had were that there is this whole other, I mean, I called it, what did I call it? Radical aesthetics or something like that. It's this question that you brought up that is about, you know, not unconventional ways of presenting information, ideas, anything. I wanted to talk about, just go into more depth with that. Like there's a few different types of processes, like this thing I talked about 16 millimeter filmmaking, where you make stuff by hand. I wanted to talk about, that's a classic experimental film technique where you use 16 millimeter film and like draw on it, scratch on it, add things to it, you know, stuff like that. It's not widely done, you know, but it's something I learned and I've incorporated into Arresting Power, I incorporated into Gentleman Bank Robber. I've made films this way. I think it's an interesting way to create textures and do some other stuff. And so I wanted to talk about that, like how you use 16 millimeter techniques or other techniques. And a few, I had another list of other things like that. Like what are some other more experimental techniques that I'll show you, like filmmakers who've done this stuff, who didn't do it for like explicitly social justice media or anything like that. But how I've kind of taken what they did and tried to, you know, bring it into documentaries and stuff. That's kind of what I was talking about. And anything else you want to talk about. We could talk about collaboration. It seems like there's a lot more to say. Mm-hmm.
Who inspires you?
Oh yeah, I know. I had like 20 filmmakers. I mean, there's so many. Well, that one guy I mentioned, I'm obsessed with, Wiseman.
Does he use radical aesthetics?
Nope. Well, he does in his duration. I mean, I think that is kind of a radical aesthetic to just like say, you're gonna watch 4 hours of hanging around a meatpacking, you know, in place and stuff like that. Like so. So time, right? Yeah, I was going to talk about that tomorrow, just duration itself. And I mean, I'm really him and Chantal Ackerman. I don't know if people know this Belgian filmmaker. She's made documentaries too, but also fiction films. She's one of my main heroes. She died a couple of years ago. She also is really durational, like 3-hour films that are often about like domestic spaces. I mean, I'm even more into her really. And I mean, there's so many. I'm really inspired by writers right now. I mean, actually, I might start I keep joking about writing my memoirs, but I might do that. I'm taking writing workshops and stuff. So I'm into a lot of. I mean, there's tons more that I'm not talking about, but like I've been reading lots of memoirs right now, and visual artists and music is. It's probably is for you too. I mean, music is like a main force in so many people's lives that we could mention as like big influences, you know. But that was the first thing I ever did. But anyway, other filmmakers, who are some other good? I mean, those are my two main touchstones. But also lots of experimental filmmakers like Tony Conrad. He was a professor of mine at Buffalo too, and he's a huge inspiration to me because he did this kind of aesthetic, structural stuff. If you don't know his work, like he got famous in 1965 for making something called the flicker, which was a frame of black, a frame of white, a frame of black, a frame of white. It was like a strobe, you know. Like filmmakers were going down this like road in the 60s where they were like, what is it really, you know? And it's just like light and dark. And so, and he got known for this, and he kept doing like formal structural stuff like that. But then in the 80s, he worked at Public Access and made like a TV show called Homework Hotline for kids to call in who really did need help with their homework. And he'd had all these other kids there, older kids who would answer the questions. And so I just love that. And he also did like noise music and stuff. This is why like what I do doesn't seem all that crazy, that I make social justice documentaries, I make my own personal stuff, because he's this huge influence for me because he just did it all. Like he just was like, I'm social sometimes, I'm gonna hang out at Public Access, I'm gonna like make a song that's one note. Like he just let it all out. He tried everything and wasn't contained. And so he's a massive influence. He died a couple of years ago too. And he was just being around him, you just felt that that aliveness, that creative energy all the time. And so he did another public access show called Studio in the Streets, where he just went out in the streets of Buffalo asking people, like, what do you think of this? What do you think of it? You know, like just this man on the street public thing. Like hanging out with him was always an adventure. Like he would see like a pipe on the ground and start jumping on it, and you know, just to see what it sounded like and just stuff like that. And so, but he also had a big social justice impulse too, you know, and he gave decades of his life to doing that kind of community media stuff. And so, yeah, there's more. I mean, that's like my biggest advice for anybody who wants to do anything is just like get into whatever it is you're into, you know? There's so many people who've done so much amazing stuff who can kind of guide the way a little bit, you know? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, cool, guys.
Great.
Thanks.